So let's continue with our investigation of economic systems. Today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the two prominent economic systems that exist in the world. Well, I don't know if I could say they're prominent. They're sort of the extreme economic systems that we see in the world, the kind of diametrical polar opposites. These economic systems are the ones that we are probably most familiar with, kind of the old Cold War conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States is maybe best encapsulated by how those two countries are set up economically. What we're going to see is that no country is purely one of these or the other, but countries lean towards one of these poles or the other. So let's take a look a little more closely now at the two primary economic systems that exist today: the command economic system and the capitalist economic system. As I mentioned, we have these two extreme systems. On one end of this the spectrum, I guess you could call it, we have the command system. Sometimes people refer to this as socialism or communism. They're not exactly the same things. Those are more political philosophies. Here we're talking about a command economic system. And under a command system, as we'll talk about, the questions of what to produce, how to produce, and for whom things will be produced are primarily answered by the state. So the government dictates, and we'll talk a little bit about the process of that. The state dictates, or the government dictates, how the economy will be set up. At the other side, or in the other corner, if you will, we have capitalism. Capitalism is differentiated from command systems because capitalism allows individuals to answer those three questions. So what are we going to produce? How are we going to produce it? And for whom things will be produced? That's all answered by individuals. And so let's kind of explore and peel back a little bit of these two systems and see what that means and kind of what that looks like. What we're going to find is that there are attributes to these different systems. And the way we look at these attributes really distinguishes them significantly from each other. Economic systems are defined by attributes. And there are multiple attributes that we could examine, but I want to look at probably the four main important attributes of economic systems. If you were taking a course in comparative economic systems or a course in comparative politics, you might explore different attributes. But for us, these four are probably the most important. The first is that their economic systems can be defined by how the organization of decision-making occurs, or what is the organization of decision-making arrangements. Secondly, we can look at economic systems through the prism of what are the mechanisms for the provision of information and coordination. Third, we can look at this through the perspective of how do the economic systems view property rights. And then finally, we can look at what are the mechanisms for setting goals and for inducing people to act. So depending upon the organization of your economic system, depending on what economic system you adopt, these attributes are going to be fundamentally different. These are the features where economic systems will almost certainly differ, and they will certainly affect economic decisions and economic outcomes that occur. We could almost put these attributes into a function, and depending on what the attributes look like, we're going to get a different outcome. Specifically, we could say that the economic system, that's ES there, is a function of the different attributes that we examine. So A1, A2, A3, all the way up through AN, which would be whatever the last attribute you want to examine. The economic system, and consequently the economic outcomes of that system, will be dependent upon what these attributes are. So let's look at the pure capitalist system. And these are just going to be kind of summary bullet point examinations. As I mentioned before, the answer to the three economic questions of what, how, and for whom are answered by private citizens, or answered by individuals. The resources of production are also owned by private citizens, so they get the choice to decide what to produce because they own the resources. Okay, so let's take a look here at pure capitalism. And again, you'll notice that kind of adjective there, pure capitalism. These are the characteristics that a capitalist system would have in its most perfect form. The three questions, as I mentioned, are going to be answered by individuals. What to produce, how to produce it, and for whom things get produced. Individuals get to answer those questions, and one of the main reasons why is because the resources of production are all owned by private citizens. So you own the land, the labor, the capital, and the entrepreneurship. Those are all part of the individuals. They get to put those together in whatever manner that they feel is best to produce the goods that they want to produce. Pure capitalism can be loosely broken down by examining four primary characteristics. Now, these are a little bit different than the attributes that we talked about before, but you're going to probably see some overlap here. In terms of private property, in a capitalist system, you have the right to do what you want with your property, as long as it's not infringing on other people. So if you want to clear cut your land for logging, then that's perfectly fine. That's your right. If you want to buy somebody else's property and prevent it from being clear cut, that's also your prerogative. You can do what you want with your resources, as long as you're not infringing upon other people. Consequently, you bear all the costs of the decisions that you're making. So if you do something really dumb with your property or your resources or your capital, then that's on you. But you also gain any kind of benefits from the use of your property. So if you are wildly successful, then you reap all the financial rewards. You don't have to share them with anybody. There's a legal system that's in place, and that legal system is used almost primarily to enforce property rights, to make sure that there's no violation of those property rights. And in a capitalist system, there's a huge incentive, there's a huge I guess what you could say, motivation to use resources efficiently. And if you're not using them efficiently, somebody's going to come along and offer to buy them from you so that they can use them efficiently. So private property, that's a big deal in a capitalist system. Also, the idea of free enterprise. You can produce and sell or buy and consume whatever you want. So there's no, or at least very few limits on the production side of a capitalist economy. You can choose your line of work. If you want to be a poet, knock yourself out. If you want to be a petroleum engineer, knock yourself out. You can choose your line of work. It doesn't mean that you're going to be successful there. I can't choose to be a world-class marathoner. That's just not sort of biologically going to happen for me. But I can choose to do that as a hobby. I can choose to run as a hobby, but as far as choosing my line of work, I can choose whatever I want. But again, I'm going to bear the costs of that decision. And if I'm successful, I will reap the rewards. You can charge what you want if you're going to sell stuff. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, you can charge whatever you want to charge. Now, it doesn't mean anyone's going to pay for it, but you can charge what you want. Now, part of deciding on charging what you want probably entails considering what people are going to think of you and whether they want to do business with you. So you have to be careful. There are consequences for the choices that you make. And I think we talked about this at some point in the past, but it's worth mentioning here that consumers are sovereign, that people vote with their dollars. So if you produce things people want, that's spectacular. But if you don't, then people are going to leave, and that's part of bearing the costs of how you use your resources. We also mentioned the idea of the invisible hand. By seeking your own self-interest, by choosing the things that you want to make and hopefully becoming profitable, you're going to have to satisfy what other people want and make their lives better. You can't avoid that. The third feature of competition, of a capitalist market, is that there is competition. There tend to be large numbers of buyers and sellers for lots of different things. There's free entry and exit into the market, and no single entity controls the market because there are just so many other people who can step in and say, hey, if you don't like the quality of the product that my competition is providing, if you don't like the price, well, come and buy from me. There tends to be lots of competition in a purely capitalist market. Now, not everything can be competitive, but there's lots of competition, and competition is encouraged. The last of these characteristics is what we call laissez-faire. There's a very minimal role of government in the economy. It's not that government shouldn't be there. Adam Smith talks about the role of government in the economy, and that's an important thing. Governments should do certain kinds of things. They do them better than a private sector would, and they do it for they create an environment in which private companies and free markets can thrive, but it's just very, very limited. So we have this laissez-faire characteristic. Now, command systems, particularly pure command systems here, are just about as opposite of a capitalist system as you can get. In the extreme, a pure command system is going to find that all inputs are owned by the state, even the people. So that if the government wants you to do a particular job and you don't want to do that job, you're just out of luck. They're going to move you to that particular job. They're going to force you into that occupation. Markets aren't permitted to work, so we're not going to have any market setting prices. There's going to be some committee that says this is what the price will be. Why? Well, because that's what we think the price should be. The state controls everything, and so the answer to the three questions of what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom things should be produced, the answer is the government. The government sets prices. The government decides what the economy needs and what the people need. They decide on quality. They decide on just what the color of things should be. And as a result of that, consumers play an incredibly passive role. They're just there. They're kind of bystanders. So at issue between these two systems is whether or not anybody can actually coordinate an economy. A good capitalist would say, no, you can't coordinate an economy. And someone in a command economic system would say, absolutely we can. We can organize it so that it performs more efficiently, so it performs better, so it satisfies people's wants more completely. Markets transmit information in a capitalist system, and without them, you don't have the proper information that you need to make these kind of decisions. But in the command system, without a price mechanism, the information is collected through talking to the people in these different industries. The problem is, of course, is that takes time. And so the transmission of information can take a long, long time to make its way to the proper decision-making authorities. So let's take a look just here really quickly at a couple of examples of command economic systems. They come in different forms. In Cuba, of course, we have the Castros, and sadly, or maybe not sadly, Fidel is no longer in charge, but Cuba has had this socialist experiment for decades and decades and decades, and part of that socialist experiment included a command economic system. The government decided what there would be available to the population. In North Korea, we see this very stark example of a command economic system where the North Korean government plots everything out. Of course, they have a pretty good military, but they don't have much of anything else. In Saudi Arabia is more of a planned economy than a pure command economy. This is led by the House of Saud, and they organize things. They kind of plan things out to a very extensive degree. And then we have Iran, which is also sort of on the we're planning the economy, and so we have the Ayatollahs at the top of the religious and really at the top of the government system there as well, planning things out, coordinating the economy. People don't always like this. In Iran, we've seen more uprisings, not a whole lot recently, but certainly more so than we've ever seen in Cuba or North Korea or even Saudi Arabia. So that's just a real down and dirty kind of quick review of what a command and a capitalist economic system look like. Um, what I want to do now is I want to sort of explore some of these things in more detail by focusing on those four attributes that I talked about a few minutes ago. So now that you're kind of familiar with a capitalist system and a command system, at least the basics of those things, let's see what those two systems look like in the context of those four attributes. So attribute one was the organization of decision making. The organization of decision making. Economic systems facilitate decisions concerning the allocation of resources. And this is one of the most important things an economic system can do, is to figure out or try to set up the process by which resources are allocated. One way to differentiate the economic systems is the level at which the decisions are made. So we could have a decentralized system where decisions are made at lower levels, or we could have a centralized system where the decisions are made at upper levels. So this is sort of, here's the individual making the decision, they're the lower level. The upper level would be somebody in the government. Let's see, so here they kind of have a military hat on. So that's one way that we can separate these two economic systems, is looking at the organization of decision making. How does the decision making take place? So we can see this based on two specific factors which determine the level of resource allocation. Resource allocation occurs, and one way that occurs is based on how the authority is distributed within a hierarchy. How is the authority distributed within the hierarchy? What I mean here is, how many levels of bureaucracy are there really? And then secondly, what's the manner in which the hierarchy uses information? What is the manner in which the hierarchy, the bureaucracy, the governmental authorities, what's the manner in which they use information? So, in a perfectly centralized economy, the authority to make decisions rests in a single central command which issues order to lower levels. That's basically this right here. So we have this this authority. It might be a single individual, it might be a small group of people, which issues orders, and they say, basically, y'all going to follow our orders. In a perfectly decentralized economy, the authority rests with the lower levels of decision making, and these decisions take place sort of separate from or decoupled from any kind of superior. So you don't have to go and get permission to make these decisions as far as allocating resources. Economic systems can be characterized, at least in part, as these centralized, decentralized views or versions of themselves on the basis of where the authority to make decisions lie. So does your economic system focus on centralized decision making or decentralized decision making? Another issue is how you handle information. In a centralized system, all information is held by a single decision maker. So again, here's this kind of ruling power, and this person has collects all this information. They know about all the participants, they know about their actions, they know about the environment in which economic activity is taking place, and you transmit only limited bits of information to lower level decision-making units. Basically, information is distributed based on a need-to-know basis. The centralized decision maker, they know everything. And they tell people what they need to know, and pretty much that's all they need to know. In a decentralized system, the top decision makers don't know everything. In fact, they may know very little. In this case, the economic system generates processes and utilizes information at the lowest level of the organization. So again, it's these people at the low levels who know how to do things. And they do their job, and then they transmit whatever information the next person in line needs to know. So there's no exchange of information with the highest level of people. With the centralized decision maker, they distribute information to those lower level people who need to know what. So they get a little bit of information. But in a decentralized way, those lower levels of information, sort of the lower levels of production, pass them on up, past what information the upper levels need to continue doing whatever job they're doing. So if we look at these two different systems, the capitalist system and the command system, the capitalist system tends to be much more the decentralized system. Whereas the command system is much more centralized. The second attribute that we talked about was involves the mechanisms for provision of information and coordination. The mechanisms for the provision of information and coordination. So here what we're looking at is basically the two approaches, the market system and the planned economy, or the capitalist and the command system. Both provide information and coordinate decisions. There's no question about that. They have to do those kinds of things. Markets tend to be linked to the decentralized, and the planned economies, the command economies, tend to be linked to the centralized decision-making dissemination, as we mentioned just a few minutes ago. How centralized an economic system is relies primarily on the type of planning mechanism. So what's the mechanism for provision of information and coordination? How do you coordinate the economy? The key here is a planned economy has subunits, and those subunits in the economy are coordinated by specific instructions or a directive formulated by the planning body. This is the infamous 5-year plan. A 5-year plan that the Soviet economies would come up with every 3 or 5 years to say this is the direction that we're going. And so any kind of information, any kind of coordination is disseminated through this formal plan. And again, this is the governmental body that dictates down to those lower levels. The participants carry out the directives, so those lower levels are told what to do. They carry out the directives by incentives designed by the planning committee. Now, in this case, the planned system and the market systems are mutually exclusive because the planner usurps the market. The planner takes over. The planner says basically, look, we don't need those stinking market. We're going to coordinate things, and we know best. Now, in between command system and the capitalist system, the pure command and the pure capitalist, is something that's referred to as indicative planning. So this is sort of a partly middle ground, indicative planning. In this case, the market serves to allocate resources. So there is a role for the market. The market allocates resources, but here's the distinction. There's a plan that's devised to guide decision making. So there is a plan, but it's kind of behind the scenes. It's sort of, there's this kind of puppet master idea here. The market will allocate resources, but there's a plan. So we need to achieve this goal, and we'll see what the market does in terms of setting prices to help us achieve that goal. The planner tries to project aggregate trends. So they're trying to look into the future and see what's going on. What are the mechanisms? What are the machinations of the overall macroeconomy? And they try to provide additional information beyond what is supplied by the market. So there's a lot of interaction here between the individual markets and the planners. They are intricately connected. The plan isn't broken down into directives, and there's no micromanagement. So per se, so much that we see in the as much as what we see in the command economy. But the smaller units, those lower levels, are doing what they need to do to fulfill the plan. So they use the market, they look at market prices to try to fulfill whatever the plan is. This tends to be more along the lines of what we're seeing in state-run capitalism, which is sort of a new hybridized economic system, where the state plans things, but they do rely upon some of the normal market signals and market mechanisms to help them achieve their objectives. This is what we see currently in China, for example. As far as the market is concerned, there's a reliance on demand and supply and price mechanisms to guide decision makers. The price and profit signals direct behavior, not a plan. So in a state-run capitalist system, profits are a possibility. In a command system, a pure command system, that's not going to happen. So prices and profit signals are looked at, and they're followed as long as those things are helping to lead towards whatever the ultimate plan is. So to wrap up this particular attribute, as far as who the ultimate decision makers are, the ultimate decision maker in a capitalist system, of course, is the individual. Consumers are sovereign. So consumers and individuals get to make choices. They send signals to producers, and you vote in the marketplace. Again, what is going to be produced? Well, the consumer and the marketplace decide those kinds of things. In a planned system, in a command economic system where things are planned out, the ultimate decision maker, of course, is whoever the planner is. The planner's preferences prevail. What's going to be produced is decided by the planner, and the planners base their instructions to the producers on what is called a social preference function. Involved in this, of course, is whose preferences are we really talking about? Is this really society's preferences? Is this really what people would choose if given their druthers? Nevertheless, involved with this are some political issues. If you want to promote incentives, or maybe due to benevolence, consumer interests have to be considered at least a little bit. For example, if you don't fulfill consumers' needs to have food on the shelf, then that's a really bad thing for society. Now, you're not going to have the choices, you're not going to have the variety that you would have in a capitalist system, but you have to put at least some food on the shelves in a command system. You can't just devote all of your resources to making the leadership well off, because that's not in society's best interest. But that social preference function tends to be a kind of a misnomer, because it's really not society's interests, although you do have to keep people satisfied minimally. And we see this probably most directly and most disturbingly in North Korea. In North Korea, they have a great big army, but most of the population is starving to death. All right, let's take a look at the third of our attributes. That's the attribute of property rights. Here, ownership rights can be divided into three different types. We have the disposition. And with disposition, as far as this type of property right is concerned, this is a transfer of ownership rights. So if I want to sell you something, I'm selling the right to use it when that is sold. So this is a transfer of property rights. I can't come back to you later and say, you're misusing my property. I still have the rights even though you own the property. That just wouldn't make any sense. There's the utilization aspect of property rights. And what we mean here is that the owner can use an item however they wish. This is the use right. And so if you buy a car from me, you can use it to drive across the country. You can use it to haul garbage. You can use it however you want. It's your property. So there's a transfer of the right. There's the right to use things. And then there's the right to use the output however you want. So you can use the property itself however you want, but you can also use the output that's produced by the item. So this is the final output of your property. So it's not like you can acquire property, use it to produce something, and then someone's going to take the final output of your property. If you've ever read the book Atlas Shrugged, this is one of the key components to that particular novel, that people are owners of property. They're using their property how they see fit, but then society is starting to co-opt the output. So these rights can be temporary or permanent, and they may rest with different people. These are all components of overall property rights. And so think about this. If you rent a car, so you go out to Enterprise and you rent a car, you have the right to utilization. You can use that property within limits, of course. If you drive it off of a bridge, that's one thing. You can do that with your own property, but you have the right to use this particular item, but you don't have the right to dispossess it. You don't have the right of disposition. You can't transfer the property of the rented car to somebody else. There are also three broad forms of property ownership. So we have the three different the way rights can be divided, but we can also look at three broad forms of property ownership. One of those is private property. Of course, this is where the ownership rights rest with an individual. There is public property, and this is where the ownership rights, all three ownership rights, rest with the state. And so these are the clear diametric opposites. So we have disposition, utilization, and the right to use output. Those types of property rights are all owned by the individual with the private property. They're all owned by the state with public property. And then we have the collective, which is a form of property right, where ownership rights are mixed and the degree of mixing varies. So it might be that you have the right to use the property, but you don't have the right to use the output. That would be kind of the idea of Atlas Shrugged, like I just talked about. So it kind of depends upon the way the economic system sets things up. These ownership rights can clearly affect economic outcomes. So how are you going to define your property rights? It's going to have a direct impact on economic outcomes. For example, with private property rights, owners seek to maximize lifetime incomes, so capital is dispersed to yield the highest rate of returns given all the risk conditions. In other words, income that comes from the property goes to the individual. And as a result of that, individuals bear the risks and they also reap the rewards. So in a capitalist system, we tend to see much more risk-taking, and we also tend to see a much wider distribution of income. Because as people take risks, some of them are going to have success. Some of them are going to have significant rewards. With public property ownership, so this is the capitalist private property. With public ownership, we see the capital allocation focuses on the social rates of return. And as a result of that, the income doesn't go to the individual, the income goes to society or to the state. So with public property, the individual doesn't reap the reward, so there's far less risk. And as a result of that, the distribution of income is much smaller. Because there aren't people who are out there taking risks because they get to keep whatever proceeds that they receive. Property rights are a very easy way to identify economic systems, and they're certainly more measurable than some of the other attributes that we've taken a look at. All right, so let's get to the last of our attributes, and that is the incentive. How are people incentivized to perform? These types of incentives should induce participants at lower levels to fulfill the directives of participants at the higher levels. We can look at incentives in three different ways, or through three different conditions for the incentive. The first is that whoever receives the reward should be able to influence the outcomes for which the reward is given. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you increase your productivity, then that should lead to an increase in pay. So your ability to earn more should be linked to your effort level. The second thing is that the upper level must be able to monitor and verify the activity of the agent. So there's got to be some tool by which monitoring of behavior occurs. Otherwise, the people who actually put forth the effort may not be properly compensated. And finally, the reward must matter to the agent. How do we get agents? How do we get the lower levels? So here, this is basically the agent of the upper level. How do we get the agent to be interested in doing what they need to do? Well, we've got to make the reward matter. So if it means that you get a bonus in your paycheck, that matters to the agent. If it means that say the upper level decision makers get to go on vacation because of the hard work of the agents aren't likely to work very hard. Due to the imperfect information of the superior, the subordinate, the lower level worker, knows much more about what's going on in terms of their own effort and actual productivity. So a flawed incentive system is not going to induce the proper amount of effort. You need to meet these three conditions to get the right effort level. So, what are some of the different types of incentives? To kind of put you in the right frame of mind, here's a clip from a movie that most people haven't seen before, but this really gets to the kind of the heart of incentives. The movie is called Glengarry Glen Ross, and a new manager comes into this little office and sets up the incentive structure right away.
The rich get richer, that's the law of the land. Who belongs to the beer?
It is 7:30.
So who's that?
And where's Mr. Roman?
Well, I'm not a leash, so I don't know, do I?
Let me have your attention for a moment. Let's talk about something important. Are they all here? All but one.
Well, I'm going anyway.
Let's talk about something important. Put that coffee down. Coffee's for closers only. I'm here from downtown. I'm here from Mitch and Murray. And I'm here on a mission of mercy.
Your name's Levine. You call yourself a salesman? I don't gotta listen to this shit.
You certainly don't, pal. Because the good news is you're fired. The bad news is you've got just 1 week to regain your job, starting with tonight. Starting with tonight's sit.
Oh, have I got your attention now? Good.
Because we're adding a little something to this month's sales contest. As you all know, first prize is a Cadillac Eldorado. Anybody want to see second prize?
Second prize is center steak knives.
Third prize is you're fired.
You get the picture? You laughing now?
Now, how would you like to work in an office like that? Clearly, incentives are now at play here. So, what are different types of incentives? One type of incentive is what we call the material incentive. This promotes behavior by awarding a claim to a material good. So, it could be to money, it could be to a Cadillac Eldorado, it could be a promotion. There's some direct connection to your behavior, to your effort level. A second type of incentive is what we call a moral incentive. The moral incentive is very different. It rewards desirable behavior by appealing to your responsibility. Basically, it appeals to your responsibility to the people around you, or your responsibility to society or to the country. You're doing it for the motherland. You're doing it for the fatherland. This is something that you should be doing. This might raise the recipient's social status, but there's no material improvement. So it's done for just sense of duty. So you need to have a lot of rallies to try to motivate people to want to perform out of their sense of duty. Now, in capitalism, neoclassical economic theory of distribution means that you have a financial incentive for providing inputs into the system. And if you don't, then you get no reward. So in a capitalist system, we tend to see a much greater focus on the material incentive. In a command system, we tend to see more of a focus on the moral incentive. Marx says that the material incentives will fade away and the moral incentives will become more important as society develops. We see kind of some of this in the economy right now. People are trying to do things based on the moral incentives as they try to help their fellow citizens deal with exposure to coronavirus. People are making masks and distributing them free of charge. There certainly is the capitalist incentive. So we have people who are trying to sell things on eBay, but we also have people who are doing good just out of a sense of trying to help their fellow man. So we see that even in the economy that we're engaged in today, even in this virus-based or this pandemic economy. So this notion of a materialist and a moral incentive structure are really quite interesting. We see these things applying to us today. We see that certainly there are people out there in the market who are trying to make a killing on hoarding hand sanitizer and respirators. And we look at those people and we recoil a little bit. We understand from an economic perspective that, hey, you're trying to reward yourself materially for looking forward. But there's that materialist incentive that exists out there, and there's no doubt about that. But we also see a moral incentive that's rising up in our economy today, because people are doing things out of their sense of duty, out of their desire to help other people who are going through hard times. So whether it's somebody at home making a bunch of masks and then taking them out to their neighbors and refusing point blank to take any compensation for that, whether it's a company who's diverting their production process to making face shields for doctors' offices, those are people who are engaging in economic activity for the moral incentive far more so than the materialist incentive. So, in a capitalist economy like ours, we see that moral incentives and material incentives both have a role to play. We tend to see that material incentives are lacking in command systems, and the moral incentive tends to be more the priority. So let's just at this point now sum up and kind of put a bow on this idea of economic systems. When it comes to the four attributes that we talked about, we have the organization of decision making, we have the provision of information and coordination, we had the property rights, and we had incentives. If we take a look at each one of those, we can see that there are different ways of approaching this. So from the organization of decision making, you can have either centralized, so that's one option, or you could have a second option, which would be decentralized. As far as the provision of information and coordination, you could do this either through a market, or you could do this through a planned system where government agents set up a plan, and the plan is followed, and people within the economy follow that plan. As far as property rights are concerned, you can have private property rights, you could have public property rights, or you could have this sort of cooperative or this communal set of property rights. And then finally, as far as incentives are concerned, you would have moral incentives or material incentives. Economic systems are characterized multidimensionally in terms of these four attributes or these four characteristics. So let's take a look at how we would overlay these attributes onto our economic systems as we conclude. So here's decision making. Here is information and coordination, property rights, and incentives. For a capitalist system, we would see that decision making is primarily decentralized. We see that information is primarily coordinated through markets. We would see that property rights are primarily private, and that incentives tend to be material. In a command system, we see that decision-making tends to be more centralized, that information is coordinated primarily through a planned system or through the government. Property rights tend to be owned by the state, so we would say that they are publicly owned, and that incentives tend to be moral. And we can add one more column here, something called market socialism or state-run capitalism. This is definitely a different type of economic system, but it's an economic system that's gaining more and more prominence. Again, this is more so like what China does, and countries that have been command systems in the past are transitioning more towards this state-run capitalist system. The decision-making is primarily decentralized here, not entirely, but primarily, but information and coordination tends to be more planned. Property rights are more communal, more collective. So there's still not that sense of pure ownership of what you have, although there are relaxations of what you can own and what you can't own. But in a state-run capitalist system, we see a mix of incentives of material and moral. So that wraps up our look at economic systems, and really, in reality, and I think that just that last column in the last slide there of the state-run capitalist, I think hopefully you get the idea that economic systems are not purely one or the other. We have countries that are certainly more capitalist and certainly more command. You know, the United States is more of a capitalist economy. Australia is more of a capitalist economy. Japan, South Korea, much of Europe are certainly more capitalist economies. But we can see attributes in all of those places where there are limitations on what you can do and how you can answer the three questions of what, how, and for whom to produce. In the United States, if I want to produce with child labor, I'm not going to, may be able to get it done for a little while, but there are rules against using child labor. So I can't do I can't produce things exactly how I want in the way that I want, because there are rules, there are limits, there are regulations that are placed on businesses. And for the most part, society accepts and believes that those rules and limitations are important. But in the real world, or as a result of that in the real world, we see that economies and economic systems are much more mixed. So the U.S. economy is much more of a capitalist system, much more so than a place like Vietnam, which is more command still, but it's more of a matter of degrees. What we're going to move into now to wrap up the course is to take a look at free markets and kind of the influence and impact of free markets at the macroeconomic level. This is an area that involves the idea of institutions greatly, but I want to take a look at some specific examples of how at the macro level, free markets make a significant difference in the outcomes and the standards of living of people.